They say love can be blind, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes it blinds you to your own reflection in the mirror, to the bruises that tell a story you're too ashamed to read aloud. There's a special kind of darkness that settles over a woman's heart when the man who promised to cherish her becomes the very person she fears most in this world. That darkness consumed 37 years of my life, and it took me blacking out on my kitchen floor to finally see the light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Hello, my beautiful souls. This is Karyle speaking to you from my cozy little apartment here in Portland, Oregon. I'm 74 years old now, and my silver hair tells the story of decades I never thought I'd live to see. Today, I want to share with you the hardest chapter of my life, not because I enjoy reliving the pain, but because I know somewhere out there is a woman who needs to hear that survival is possible, that starting over at any age is not just a dream, but a reality waiting to unfold. I was born in 1950 in the small town of Millfield, Ohio, where everybody knew everybody and secrets were as rare as snow in July. My father, Tom, was a gentleman who worked at the local grain elevator, coming home each evening with his clothes dusty, but his spirit intact. He never raised his voice to my mother, Sarah, never so much as slammed a door in anger. I watched him treat my mother like she was made of precious china, opening doors for her, bringing her wildflowers from the fields, kissing her forehead every morning before heading to work. My mother, Sarah, was the kind of woman who could make a feast from scraps and turn our tiny two-bedroom house into a palace, with nothing but love and determination. She taught me that a woman's strength wasn't measured by how much she could endure, but by how much joy she could create in the midst of hardship. Every Sunday after church, she would gather us around the kitchen table for what she called our weekly blessing count, where we'd each share 3 things that made us grateful. Looking back, those moments were the foundation of everything good I would carry with me through the storms ahead. Our house sat on Maple Street, a row of modest homes with front porches where neighbors would gather in the evenings to share stories and sweet tea. I grew up believing that marriage was supposed to be a partnership built on respect, kindness, and shared dreams. I watched my parents dance in the living room to songs on the old radio, saw them support each other through my father's brief unemployment when the grain elevator cut workers, witnessed them celebrate small victories like they were winning the lottery. I was their only child, born when they had almost given up hope of having children. Perhaps that's why they poured so much love into me, why they made sure I understood my worth wasn't tied to what others thought of me, but to the goodness I carried in my heart. My father would tell me every night before bed, "Karyle, my sweet girl, you deserve to be treated like the treasure you are. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." School was where I thrived, losing myself in books and dreams of becoming a teacher. I loved the idea of shaping young minds, of being the kind of adult who could make a difference in a child's life. My teachers encouraged me, telling my parents I had a natural gift for connecting with others, for making people feel seen and valued. I graduated as valedictorian of my small class in 1968, earning a scholarship to Ohio State University that would change the trajectory of my life in ways I never could have imagined. College was a revelation. Columbus felt like the biggest city in the world compared to Millfield, with its bustling campus and students from every corner of the state. I threw myself into my education studies, working part-time at the campus library to help with expenses. It was there, between the towering shelves of books and the quiet whispers of studying students, that I first began to dream of the life I wanted to build. I met my roommate Jennifer on move-in day, a girl from Cincinnati with wild curly hair and an infectious laugh. She became my closest friend, the sister I never had, and through her I was introduced to a world of possibilities I had never considered. We would stay up late talking about our futures, about the men we would marry, the children we would raise, the impact we would make on the world. Jennifer wanted to be a journalist, to travel the world and tell stories that mattered. I wanted to teach third grade, to be the teacher who made learning magical for 8-year-olds who still believed in wonder. It was during my junior year, in the spring of 1971, that I met David Mitchell at a campus mixer. He was 25 to my 21, a graduate student in engineering who carried himself with a confidence that drew me in immediately. David was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through me. When he asked me to dance that first night, I felt like I was floating on air. David was everything I thought I wanted in a man. He was ambitious, talking about his plans to start his own construction company after graduation. He was charming, bringing me flowers every Friday and writing me letters even though we saw each other nearly every day. He was attentive in a way that made me feel like the most important person in the world. When he looked at me, I felt beautiful, special, chosen. Our courtship was like something out of a romance novel. David would pick me up in his blue Chevrolet and drive us to quiet spots by the river, where we would talk for hours about our dreams. He told me about growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, about the construction boom happening there, and how he planned to be part of it. He painted pictures of the life we could build together, a beautiful house with a garden where I could grow vegetables like my mother did, children playing in a backyard under the desert sun. I was completely swept away by his vision, by the way he included me in every plan he made. David would say things like, "When we're married, Karyle," and "Our children will be so lucky to have you as their mother." He never officially proposed during college, but there was an understanding between us that our futures were intertwined, that we were building towards something permanent and beautiful. My parents met David during my senior year when he drove me home for Thanksgiving. I watched nervously as my father shook his hand, as my mother served him her famous apple pie, as they all sat around our small kitchen table getting to know each other. David was on his best behavior, complimenting my mother's cooking, asking my father thoughtful questions about his work, helping with the dishes without being asked. After David left to drive back to Columbus, my mother took me aside in the kitchen where we had shared so many conversations over the years. "He seems like a nice young man, Karyle," she said, but there was something in her voice that I couldn't quite identify. "Just remember what your father and I have always taught you about how a man should treat the woman he loves." I brushed off the subtle warning, convinced that my mother was just being overprotective. David had been nothing but wonderful to me, romantic and devoted and full of plans for our future together. When he received his job offer from a construction company in Phoenix and asked me to move there with him after graduation, I said yes, without hesitation. We were married in a small ceremony at my childhood church in June 1972, with Jennifer as my maid of honor and David's college roommate as his best man. My parents threw us a reception in the church fellowship hall, with my mother's friends providing the food and my father's buddies from the grain elevator taking turns playing music on their guitars. It wasn't fancy, but it was filled with love and hope, and the belief that we were starting something beautiful together. The first years in Phoenix were everything David had promised they would be. We rented a small apartment in a neighborhood, full of young couples like us, all chasing their American dreams under the Arizona sun. David threw himself into his work, quickly earning a reputation as a reliable, skilled worker who could handle any challenge. I found a position teaching third grade at a school in our district, finally living out my childhood dream of shaping young minds. Our first home was a modest ranch house with a backyard perfect for the garden I had always wanted. I spent weekends planting tomatoes and peppers, creating the kind of space where children could run and play safely. David worked long hours, but always came home excited to tell me about his day, about the projects he was working on, about his plans to eventually start his own company. In 1974, our daughter Emma was born, a perfect little girl with David's dark hair and my stubborn chin. Holding her for the first time, I felt a completeness I had never experienced before. David was an attentive father those first few years, coming home eager to hold Emma, to help with bedtimes and diaper changes. He would sit in the rocking chair in her nursery, reading her stories in his deep voice while I watched from the doorway, my heart full of gratitude for the life we had built. Our son Michael followed in 1976, a sweet boy with gentle eyes who seemed to absorb everything around him with quiet intensity. With 2 children under 3, our house was filled with the beautiful chaos of young family life. I took a few years off from teaching to focus on raising our babies, creating the kind of home I had grown up in, where love was abundant and every day held small celebrations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David's construction company was growing steadily, and by 1978, he had hired his first employees. Success seemed to agree with him, though I began to notice small changes in his demeanor. He was more impatient when he came home tired, more critical of small things like toys left out or dinner not being ready exactly when he walked through the door. I told myself it was just the stress of building a business, the pressure of providing for a growing family. The first time David raised his voice at me was over something so trivial, I can barely remember what it was. Maybe the house wasn't clean enough, or maybe dinner was late because Michael had been fussy all day. What I do remember is the shock of hearing my gentle husband speak to me with such harshness, the way his voice filled our small kitchen with an anger I had never heard before. He apologized immediately, pulling me into his arms and explaining that he was just exhausted, that work had been particularly demanding that week. "I'm so sorry, baby," he whispered into my hair. "You know I would never mean to hurt you. You and the kids are everything to me." And I believed him, because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. The apologies became a pattern. David would lose his temper over something small, his voice would escalate until I felt like I was shrinking inside myself, and then he would realize what he had done and shower me with affection and promises that it would never happen again. Each time I convinced myself that the stress was temporary, that once his business was more established, once the children were older, once life settled into a more predictable rhythm, everything would return to the way it used to be. But stress has a way of revealing who people really are underneath the masks they wear, and slowly, gradually, I began to see sides of David that I had never imagined existed. The man who had once brought me flowers every Friday began to criticize the way I arranged them in the vase. The husband who had once praised my cooking started to complain that nothing I made was quite right. The father, who had once delighted in reading bedtime stories, began to lose patience when the children were anything less than perfectly behaved. By 1980, when Emma was 6 and Michael was 4, the yelling had become a regular occurrence in our household. David's anger seemed to have a life of its own, erupting over things that had never bothered him before. If the children were too loud, while he was watching television, if I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning, if dinner was 5 minutes later than he expected, his voice would boom through the house in a way that made all of us freeze. I found myself walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring the atmosphere in our home, trying to anticipate what might set him off next. I became an expert at reading his moods, at knowing when to keep the children quiet, when to suggest they play outside, when to simply make myself invisible until the storm passed. This was not the life I had dreamed of, not the marriage I had watched my parents model, but I was trapped in it by love, by fear, by the hope that somehow I could fix what was broken. The physical violence started small, as it always does. A hand gripping my arm too tightly during an argument. A push that sent me stumbling backward when I tried to calm him down. The first time David's hand connected with my cheek, we both stood there in shocked silence, as if neither of us could believe what had just happened. The sound seemed to echo in our kitchen long after the pain had faded, a line crossed that we could never uncross. "Karyle, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what came over me. This will never happen again, I promise you." And he cried, actual tears streaming down the face of the man I had married. The man I had trusted with my heart and my future and the safety of our children. He held me gently that night, his hands shaking as he traced the outline of the bruise he had left on my face, swearing on everything he held sacred that he would never hurt me again. But promises made in the aftermath of violence are like bandages on wounds that are too deep to heal properly. They might cover the damage temporarily, but underneath, the infection continues to spread. David's remorse was genuine in those moments, but it was also temporary, lasting only until the next time his anger overcame his better judgment. The years began to blur together in a cycle of tension, explosion, remorse, and temporary peace. I became skilled at covering bruises with makeup, at explaining away injuries with stories about clumsiness, at maintaining the facade of a happy marriage even as the foundation of our life together crumbled beneath my feet. I told myself I was protecting our children, keeping our family together, being the strong woman my mother had raised me to be. But strength, I was learning, sometimes meant knowing when to leave, and I wasn't there yet. I was still believing in the man David had been, still hoping he would find his way back to the person who had courted me so gently, still convinced that my love could somehow heal whatever was broken inside him. I was still the woman who counted blessings instead of bruises, who made excuses instead of escape plans, who prioritized keeping the peace over keeping herself safe. The children grew older, and I watched them learn to navigate their father's moods just as I had. Emma became a people-pleaser, always trying to be the perfect daughter who never caused problems. Michael retreated into books and quiet activities, making himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. My heart broke watching them lose their childhood innocence to the reality of living with someone whose anger could explode without warning. But I told myself that at least we were all together, that at least David never directed his physical violence toward them. By the time Emma started high school and Michael entered middle school, I had become a master at living two lives. In public, I was Karyle Mitchell, the devoted wife and mother, the woman who volunteered at school events and brought casseroles to neighbors in need. In private, I was a woman who flinched when doors slammed too loudly, who planned her days around avoiding conflict, who had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely in her own home. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March 1989, a date that is burned into my memory like a brand. It started, as these things always did, with something insignificant. I had been helping Michael with his science project at the kitchen table when David came home from work, already in a foul mood because a client had been difficult that day. The poster board and markers were spread across the table where he usually expected to find his dinner waiting, and the sight of this small disruption was enough to ignite the rage that was always simmering just beneath the surface. "What the hell is this mess?" he demanded, his voice already rising to the volume that made my stomach clench with familiar dread. "I work all day to provide for this family, and I can't even come home to a clean house and a decent meal?" I immediately began gathering Michael's school supplies, my hands shaking as I tried to clear the table quickly. "I'm sorry, honey. Dinner will be ready in just a few minutes." Michael and I were just finishing up his project. But David was beyond reasoning with, his anger feeding on itself until it became something wild and uncontrollable. He swept the science project off the table with one violent motion, sending markers and carefully cut pieces of poster board flying across the kitchen floor. Michael, my sweet 14-year-old boy, made a small sound of distress at seeing his work destroyed, and that tiny expression of hurt was all it took to push David over the edge completely. "Don't you dare make that noise at me, you little brat," he snarled at our son. And in that moment, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me more than his anger ever had. It was the look of a man who had lost all connection to his humanity, who was capable of anything. "David, please," I said, stepping between him and Michael, my voice as calm as I could make it despite the terror racing through my veins. "He's just upset about his project. Let me clean this up and get dinner started." What happened next exists in my memory like a series of still photographs, each moment frozen in perfect, horrible clarity. David's face contorting with rage, his hand drawing back. The impact that sent me flying backward into the counter. The sound of my head hitting the cabinet door. The taste of blood in my mouth. And then, mercifully, nothing. When I woke up, I was lying on the kitchen floor with Emma kneeling beside me, her face streaked with tears as she pressed a wet towel to my forehead. Michael was standing in the corner, his eyes wide with shock, his young face aged by what he had witnessed. David was nowhere to be seen, and the silence in the house felt heavier than his shouting ever had. "Mom, are you okay?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "You were unconscious for almost 10 minutes. I wanted to call an ambulance, but Dad said no, that you just fell and hit your head." I tried to sit up, but the room spun around me like a carnival ride. There was blood on the towel Emma was using, and when I touched my scalp, I could feel the tender spot where it had connected with the cabinet. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of seeing my children's faces, of knowing they had witnessed their father's violence, of understanding that the facade I had worked so hard to maintain had finally crumbled completely. "Where is your father?" I managed to ask, though speaking made my head throb. "He left," Michael said quietly. "He said he was going for a drive to cool down, but that was over an hour ago." That night, lying in bed with an ice pack pressed to my throbbing head, I finally admitted to myself what I had been denying for years. This was not a rough patch in our marriage that would smooth itself out with time and patience. This was not stress-related behavior that would improve once David's business became more successful. This was domestic violence, pure and simple, and it was escalating to the point where my life and my children's safety were in genuine danger. The woman who had grown up watching her father treat her mother like precious china, who had been raised to believe in the sanctity of marriage and the importance of keeping families together, finally understood that some promises are meant to be broken when keeping them means sacrificing everything you are. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to David's truck finally pull into the driveway, I began to plan my escape. The morning after I blacked out, David came to me with coffee and toast on a tray, his eyes red-rimmed from what I assumed was a sleepless night. He sat on the edge of our bed with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal, his voice soft and broken as he apologized for the 100th time in our marriage. "Karyle, sweetheart, I don't know what's happening to me," he whispered, his hands trembling as he set the tray on my nightstand. "The stress from work, the competition in the construction industry, it's eating me alive. But that's no excuse for what I did to you last night. You could have been seriously hurt." I touched the tender spot on my head where a goose egg had formed, feeling the dried blood in my hair that I hadn't had the energy to wash out. The physical pain was manageable, but the emotional devastation felt like a weight crushing my chest. I had spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying the look of terror on my children's faces, wondering how many other nights they had, laying in their beds listening to their father's rage echo through our home. "David, this can't continue," I said, my voice hoarse from crying. "Emma and Michael saw everything. They're terrified of you. And honestly, so am I." He broke down then, sobbing like a child as he begged for another chance. "I'll get help, I promise. I'll talk to someone, figure out why I'm so angry all the time. Please don't give up on us, Karyle. Please don't give up on our family." The man crying beside me looked so much like the David I had fallen in love with in college that for a moment I almost believed him, almost convinced myself that this time would be different, that rock bottom had finally scared him enough to change. But as I watched him weep, I realized that his tears weren't really about the pain he had caused me or the trauma he had inflicted on our children. They were about his fear of losing control, of facing consequences, of having his comfortable life disrupted by the reality of his actions. Still, I wanted to believe in redemption, in the possibility that people could change when they truly understood the damage they had caused. I agreed to give him one more chance, but with conditions that felt revolutionary for a woman who had spent 17 years accommodating his every mood and whim. "You will see a counselor," I told him, my voice stronger than I felt. "Not just for a few sessions, but for as long as it takes. You will attend anger management classes. And if you ever lay a hand on me or speak to me the way you did last night, I will take the children and leave. I'm not making empty threats anymore, David. I'm making promises." He agreed to everything, his relief so palpable that I almost felt sorry for him. Within a week, he had scheduled an appointment with a therapist across town, someone far enough away that we wouldn't risk running into anyone we knew. He signed up for anger management classes at the community center and even brought me the enrollment confirmation, as if this piece of paper could somehow erase years of fear and violence. For the first few weeks, David seemed genuinely committed to changing. He came home from his therapy sessions thoughtful and subdued, sharing insights about stress management and communication techniques he was learning. He was gentler with the children, more patient when Michael struggled with his homework, or when Emma practiced piano during his favorite television shows. He even started helping with household chores without being asked, a gesture that felt both hopeful and heartbreaking. But change, real change, is exhausting work that requires confronting ugly truths about yourself every single day. David's initial enthusiasm for therapy began to wane as the sessions dug deeper into the roots of his anger, the childhood experiences he had never properly processed, the toxic masculinity he had absorbed from his own father, who believed that showing emotion was weakness and controlling your family was strength. I could see him growing restless during our conversations about his progress, his answers becoming shorter and more defensive when I asked about what he was learning in counseling. The anger management classes, he complained, were full of losers and deadbeats who had real problems, nothing like his situation. He was just a hard-working man under pressure, he insisted, not some common abuser who belonged in a group with men who had police records and restraining orders. The first red flag that his commitment was faltering came about 6 weeks into his treatment program. I found a crumpled parking ticket in his jeans pocket when I was doing laundry, time-stamped for the exact time he was supposed to be in therapy. When I confronted him about it, he had a perfectly reasonable explanation ready. "The session was canceled at the last minute," he said without missing a beat. "Dr. Peterson had a family emergency. I drove all the way there and had to turn around and come home." I stopped at the hardware store to pick up some supplies for the Henderson job instead of wasting the afternoon. I wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because the alternative meant accepting that the man I had built my life around was not just violent, but also a liar, who would manipulate me, even as he promised to change. I filed the incident away, in the growing collection of doubts that I wasn't ready to examine too closely, choosing instead to focus on the fact that he hadn't raised his voice or his hand to me since that terrible night in March. But David's behavior was like a dam with hairline cracks that grew wider under pressure until the entire structure was compromised. The therapy sessions became increasingly sporadic, though he continued to leave the house at the appointed times and return with stories about his progress. The anger management classes were stupid and repetitive, he complained, filled with exercises that didn't apply to his situation because he wasn't like those other men who had serious problems. By summer, the improvements I had initially noticed were beginning to erode. David's patience with the children started wearing thin again, his voice taking on that edge of irritation that made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. He stopped, helping with household chores, explaining that his workload had increased, and he needed to focus his energy on providing for our family rather than wasting time on women's work. The first time he yelled at me after starting therapy, it was over something so trivial that I can't even remember the specific trigger. What I do remember is the shock of hearing that familiar tone of rage after months of carefully modulated conversations, the way my body immediately went into survival mode, muscles tensing as I prepared for an escalation that thankfully didn't come. David caught himself mid-sentence, his face cycling through surprise, guilt, and defiance, before settling on sheepish remorse. "I'm sorry, honey," he said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as genuine frustration with himself. "I'm still learning how to manage my reactions. Dr. Peterson says setbacks are normal in the recovery process." But the setbacks began happening more frequently, each one chipping away at the fragile hope I had been nurturing that our marriage could be saved. David's explanations grew more elaborate and defensive, shifting blame to external stressors while minimizing the impact of his behavior on our family. Work was more demanding than ever, he claimed. His clients were unreasonable, his employees unreliable, the economy unpredictable. How could anyone expect him to remain calm when he was carrying the weight of so many responsibilities? I found myself becoming hypervigilant again, constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of our household, ready to deflect or absorb his anger before it could touch our children. Emma and Michael had both relaxed somewhat during the initial weeks of David's supposed transformation, but they quickly learned to read the signs of his deteriorating mood, just as I did. Our home settled back into the familiar pattern of walking on eggshells, of everyone adjusting their behavior to accommodate one person's inability to control his emotions. The lies about therapy became more obvious as summer turned to fall. David would come home from his supposed sessions without the thoughtful demeanor that had initially followed his appointments. Instead, he seemed restless and agitated, often heading straight to the refrigerator for a beer and the television remote, dismissing my questions about his progress with increasingly irritated responses. One evening in September, I decided to call Dr. Peterson's office myself, using the excuse of wanting to understand how I could better support David's recovery process. The receptionist was friendly and helpful until I mentioned my husband's name, at which point her tone became carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mitchell, but I don't show any appointments for David Mitchell in our system. In fact, we don't have anyone by that name as a patient at all." The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet as I absorbed this information. David had been lying to me for months, leaving the house twice a week with the pretense of working on his anger issues, while actually going somewhere else entirely. The betrayal felt almost as devastating as the physical violence, because it shattered my last hope that he was capable of genuine change. That night, I waited until the children were asleep before confronting him with what I had discovered. I approached the conversation carefully, giving him an opportunity to explain himself, hoping against hope that there was some misunderstanding that could restore my faith in his commitment to our family. "David, I called Dr. Peterson's office today," I began, keeping my voice calm and non-accusatory. "They said you've never been a patient there. Can you help me understand what's going on?" The transformation in his face was immediate and terrifying. The mask of the reformed husband slipped away, revealing the angry, defensive man underneath who had simply been hiding his true nature for the past several months. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to the low, dangerous tone that always preceded an explosion. "You called my therapist behind my back?" he said, rising from his chair with the slow, deliberate movements of a predator. "You checked up on me like I'm some kind of child who can't be trusted?" "I was trying to help," I said, instinctively backing away from him even though he hadn't moved in my direction. "I thought if I understood your treatment better, I could be more supportive." "Supportive?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Is that what you call spying on me? Questioning my integrity? Treating me like a criminal in my own home?" The argument that followed was explosive in a way that made me grateful our neighbors lived far enough away that they couldn't hear David's voice booming through our house. He accused me of sabotaging his recovery, of being unable to forgive and move forward, of being the kind of wife who would rather tear her husband down than build him up. When I pointed out that he had been lying to me for months, he twisted my words until somehow I became the villain for discovering his deception. Maybe I stopped going to therapy because it wasn't helping, he finally admitted, his face flushed with rage. Maybe sitting in a room talking about my feelings with some overpaid shrink wasn't solving anything. Maybe the real problem is that I have a wife who doesn't trust me, who can't appreciate how hard I work to provide for this family, who calls my doctor behind my back like I'm some kind of mental patient. That night marked the end of any pretense that David was committed to changing his behavior. The angry man who had terrorized our family for years was back, and this time he was armed with the vocabulary of therapy and recovery to justify his actions. He had learned just enough about anger management to weaponize the concepts against me, turning his treatment into another tool for manipulation and control. The violence didn't return immediately, but the psychological abuse intensified. In ways that were harder to document but just as damaging, David became a master at emotional terrorism, using his intimate knowledge of my insecurities and fears to wound me in ways that left no visible marks. He criticized everything from my appearance to my parenting skills, questioning my intelligence, and my worth as a wife and mother. "No wonder the kids are so screwed up," he would say when Michael struggled with a math assignment or Emma came home upset about drama with her friends. "Look at the example they have in you. You can't even manage your own emotions. How are you supposed to teach them how to handle theirs?" He began undermining my authority with the children in subtle ways, countermanding my decisions and rolling his eyes when I tried to enforce rules about homework or chores. When Emma asked if she could go to a sleepover at a friend's house, David would override my concerns about her grades with a grand gesture of permission that made me look like the unreasonable parent. "Your mother worries too much," he would tell them with a conspiratorial smile. "She doesn't understand that you kids need to have some fun in your lives." The isolation that had been building for years became more pronounced as David systematically damaged my relationships with friends, family, and colleagues. When my mother called to check on us, he would hover nearby, making faces and gestures that conveyed his impatience with the conversation. If I made plans to have lunch with a colleague from my teaching days, he would suddenly remember an important family commitment that required my presence. "Don't you think your family should come first?" he would ask when I expressed frustration about canceling yet another social engagement. Most husbands would be insulted that their wives preferred spending time with outsiders over their own children. My world grew smaller and smaller as I lost touch with the support systems that might have helped me recognize how abnormal our situation had become. The few friends I maintained were casual acquaintances who saw only the surface of our marriage, the carefully constructed facade of successful businessman and devoted wife that we presented at school events and neighborhood gatherings. Emma and Michael adapted to the renewed tension in our household with the resilience that children develop when their survival depends on reading adult moods accurately. Emma threw herself into her studies and extracurricular activities, staying late at school for drama club and student government meetings that kept her away from home during the most volatile hours of the day. Michael retreated into his room with his books and model airplanes, emerging only for meals and family obligations. I watched my children learn to navigate their father's unpredictable moods with a skill that broke my heart. They knew when to be invisible, when to be charming, when to deflect his attention from whatever had triggered his irritation. At 15 and 13, they had developed survival skills that most adults never need to learn, and I blamed myself for every moment of their lost innocence. The financial control that had always been a feature of our marriage became more restrictive as David's behavior deteriorated. He had always handled our money, explaining that his business experience made him better qualified to make financial decisions, but now he began monitoring every penny I spent with increasing scrutiny. $47 at the grocery store? He would question, studying the receipt like a forensic accountant. What exactly did you buy that cost $47? Show me every item and explain why it was necessary. My access to cash became limited to a small weekly allowance that barely covered gas and incidental expenses. When I suggested that I should return to teaching now that both children were in school full-time, David reacted as if I had suggested abandoning our family entirely. What kind of mother puts her career ahead of her children's needs? He demanded. Emma and Michael need you here when they get home from school, not off playing teacher with other people's kids. Besides, my business is doing well enough that you don't need to work. Most women would be grateful to have a husband who can support the whole family. But I was beginning to understand that his opposition to my working wasn't about traditional gender roles or concern for our children's well-being. It was about control, about keeping me financially dependent and emotionally isolated, so that leaving would seem impossible even when staying became unbearable. The breaking point of this second phase of our deteriorating marriage came during the Christmas season of 1989, 9 months after I had first blacked out on our kitchen floor. David's construction business was struggling due to a downturn in the Phoenix housing market, and the financial stress was amplifying his already volatile temperament. We were decorating the Christmas tree on a Saturday afternoon when Michael accidentally knocked over a box of ornaments, several of which shattered on the hardwood floor. It was the kind of minor accident that happens in every household, especially when children are involved in holiday preparations. But David's reaction was swift and disproportionate. "You clumsy little idiot," he screamed, his voice filling our living room with a rage that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the air. "Do you have any idea how much those ornaments cost? They've been in our family for years, and you destroyed them because you can't watch where you're going." Michael, my sensitive 13-year-old boy, immediately began to cry, his shoulders shaking as he knelt on the floor trying to gather the broken pieces with his bare hands. Emma rushed to help him, her face pale with the fear that had become too familiar in our household, while I moved toward them with a dustpan and broom. "It was an accident, David," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through my system. "The ornaments can be replaced, and Michael didn't break them on purpose." "Don't you dare make excuses for him," David snarled, his attention shifting from our son to me with the predatory focus that always preceded his worst outbursts. "This is exactly the problem with this family. Nobody takes responsibility for anything. You coddle these kids until they think they can get away with destroying other people's property without consequences." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster. David's anger, no longer constrained by the pretense of being a reformed man, erupted with all the force of months of suppressed rage. He began shouting about everything that was wrong with our family, our marriage, our children, his voice growing louder and more abusive with each accusation. Emma and Michael huddled together on the couch, holding each other while their father's rage washed over them like a toxic tide. I stood between them and David, my body instinctively shielding my children from the worst of his verbal assault, but there was no protection from the psychological damage being inflicted on all of us. The tirade continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, David's voice hoarse from screaming as he paced around our living room like a caged animal. When he finally ran out of cruel things to say, he stormed out of the house, leaving the three of us sitting among the broken ornaments and shattered illusions of a peaceful Christmas celebration. That night, after I had tucked my traumatized children into bed with extra hugs and reassurances that none of this was their fault, I sat alone in our bedroom facing the truth I had been avoiding for months. David's brief attempt at therapy and anger management had been nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to buy him time and keep me from leaving. He had no intention of changing his behavior, no remorse for the damage he was inflicting on our family, no capacity for the kind of self-reflection that real change requires. The man I had married, the gentle college student who had courted me with flowers and poetry, either no longer existed or had never been real in the first place. What remained was an angry, controlling abuser who had learned to use my love for him and my commitment to our family as weapons against me. The fairy tale was over, and I was finally ready to write a different ending to our story. As I sat there in the darkness, listening to David's truck pull into the driveway hours later, I began to plan my escape not just from our marriage, but from the woman I had become in response to his abuse. The frightened, accommodating wife who walked on eggshells and made excuses for the inexcusable was going to have to find the strength to become someone else entirely. Someone brave enough to choose the unknown over the unbearable. Someone willing to start over at 40 years old with 2 teenagers and no clear path forward. The second phase of our marriage's destruction was ending, and the most dangerous part of my journey was about to begin. Because leaving an abusive relationship is often when the abuser's need for control becomes most desperate and most deadly. And David had already shown me exactly how far he was willing to go to maintain his power over our family. The new year of 1990 brought with it a bitter cold that seemed to seep into the very foundation of our house, matching the chill that had settled permanently in my heart. David's construction business was failing, clients were defaulting on payments, and the stress was turning him into someone I no longer recognized, even in his quieter moments. The man who had once prided himself on providing for his family was now drinking heavily every evening, sitting in his recliner with a beer in one hand and the television remote in the other, his eyes distant and angry. I had started keeping a journal, hiding it in the bottom of my lingerie drawer where I knew David would never look. Writing became my lifeline, the only place where I could acknowledge the truth of what was happening to us without fear of retaliation. Page after page filled with careful documentation of his outbursts, his threats, the way he would slam doors so hard that pictures fell from the walls, the increasing frequency of his criticism and cruel comments. February 14th, 1990. Valentine's Day. David forgot completely, coming home from work empty-handed while I had prepared his favorite meal and bought him a new tie. When I gently mentioned the date, he exploded, screaming that I was materialistic and selfish for expecting gifts when he was struggling to keep the business afloat. Emma came downstairs to see what the commotion was about and found me crying at the kitchen table while David stormed around the house, slamming cabinet doors and muttering about ungrateful wives. March 3rd, 1990. Michael brought home a report, card with all A's and 1 B+. Instead of celebrating our son's achievement, David focused on the single B+, demanding to know why Michael couldn't apply himself in science the way he did in his other subjects. I watched our 13-year-old son's face crumble as his father berated him for what should have been a moment of pride. That night, I found Michael in his room, tearing up the report card he had been so excited to show us. March 21st, 1990. David's anger reached a new level of cruelty when he discovered that I had been putting aside small amounts of grocery money to save for Emma's upcoming birthday. $23 hidden in an envelope in my recipe box became evidence of my deception and betrayal. He accused me of stealing from the family, of being a liar and a sneak who couldn't be trusted with household finances. The money was for Emma's birthday present, I explained, but he confiscated it anyway, saying that if I wanted to give our daughter gifts, I could ask him properly instead of going behind his back. By spring, I was walking through my days like a ghost, performing the motions of motherhood and wifehood while feeling completely disconnected from my own life. I had lost weight from the constant anxiety, my clothes hanging loose on a frame, that had grown thin from stress and the way my stomach churned whenever I heard David's truck in the driveway. Emma and Michael had learned to communicate with me through glances and subtle gestures, a family code that allowed us to navigate around their father's increasingly unpredictable moods. The children's friends stopped coming over to our house. Emma made excuses about why her drama club friends couldn't study at our place, suggesting instead that they meet at the library or someone else's home. Michael's best friend Tommy, who had been a regular fixture at our dinner table for years, suddenly became scarce, his mother politely declining when I called to invite him for sleepovers or weekend activities. I knew what was happening, and the shame burned in my chest like acid. Our neighbors, our friends, our children's teachers were all beginning to see through the facade we had worked so hard to maintain. The mask was slipping, and people were starting to notice the fear in my eyes, the way I flinched when David spoke sharply, the excuses I made for his increasingly antisocial behavior. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived 2 houses down and had been a friend for years, stopped by one afternoon. In April, with a casserole and a concerned expression, we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where so many arguments had erupted, and she studied my face with the careful attention of someone who had seen too much. "Karyle, honey, are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but direct. "You look tired all the time, and we haven't seen much of David lately. Is everything all right at home?" I opened my mouth to give her the standard response I had perfected over the years. The bright smile and reassuring words about how busy we were, how work was stressful but manageable, how blessed we were to have such a good life. But something in her kind eyes broke through my defenses, and for a moment I felt the overwhelming urge to tell her everything. "We're going through a rough patch," I admitted, the words feeling strange and dangerous in my mouth. "David's business is struggling, and it's putting a lot of pressure on all of us." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded, but I could see in her expression that she understood there was more to the story. "You know, mija, if you ever need anything at all, my door is always open. Sometimes life gets overwhelming, and we all need help from time to time." Her offer was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person, but I was still too afraid to grab it. What would I say? How could I explain? That my husband, the successful businessman everyone respected, was slowly destroying our family with his rage and control. How could I admit that I had allowed this to go on for so many years, that I had failed to protect my children from the psychological damage of living with constant fear and tension? After she left, I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, staring at the casserole dish and thinking about the woman I used to be before David's anger became the organizing principle of our household. I remembered the teacher who had loved her job, who had felt confident and capable, who had believed she could make a difference in the world. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime who had possessed a strength and sense of self that I could barely remember. David's drinking was becoming more obvious and more problematic. He would start with beer during dinner and progress to whiskey as the evening wore on, his speech becoming slurred and his temper even more volatile. The children learned to disappear to their rooms by 8 o'clock, before the alcohol could amplify whatever frustrations had accumulated during his day. One evening in May, I made the mistake of suggesting that perhaps he should consider cutting back on his drinking, pointing out gently that it seemed to be making his stress worse rather than better. His reaction was swift and terrifying, an explosion of rage that included threats I had never heard from him before. "Are you calling me an alcoholic?" he roared, advancing on me with unsteady steps that made his anger even more frightening. "After everything I do for this family, after working my ass off to keep a roof over your heads, you want to criticize the way I relax in my own home?" I backed away from him, my heart racing as I tried to judge whether this was going to escalate. Beyond shouting, there was something different in his eyes that night, a wildness that the alcohol had unleashed, and I realized that the man I had married was disappearing completely, replaced by someone I didn't know and couldn't predict. "I'm not criticizing you," I said, keeping my voice calm and low. "I'm just worried about you, about us. The drinking seems to be making you more upset, not less." "Don't you dare psychoanalyze me," he spat, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. "I don't have a drinking problem. I have a wife problem. I have a family that doesn't appreciate what I sacrifice for them, that questions my every decision, that makes me feel like a stranger in my own house." That night, he passed out in his recliner, and I covered him with a blanket before checking on the children. Emma was in her room with her door locked, and when I knocked softly, she opened. It just a crack to peer out at me. "Is he okay?" she whispered, and I could see the worry in her 15-year-old eyes that no child should have to carry. "He's sleeping," I told her, which was technically true but felt like a lie. "Everything's going to be fine, sweetheart." But everything was not going to be fine, and we all knew it. The next morning, David woke up hungover and ashamed, apologizing profusely for his behavior and promising to cut back on his drinking. It was a promise he would make and break repeatedly over the next several months, each cycle of remorse and relapse wearing away more of my hope that things could ever return to normal. The summer of 1990 was a blur of walking on eggshells and trying to keep our family from completely falling apart. David's construction business finally collapsed in July, the stress of unpaid invoices and canceled contracts pushing him into a depression that made his anger even more unpredictable. He would sit for hours staring at the bills spread across the kitchen table, drinking beer and muttering about clients who had screwed him over, about employees who had let him down, about a world that was conspiring against honest, hardworking men. I took a part-time job at a local department store, telling David it was just temporary, just until his business recovered, but secretly hoping it would give me some financial independence and a reason to be away from the house for a few hours each day. The job paid minimum wage and the hours were exhausting, but it was a relief to be around normal people who spoke to each other with basic courtesy and respect. My supervisor, Janet, was a woman in her 50s who had raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband left her for a younger woman. She had a no-nonsense attitude and a kind heart, and she seemed to see right through my attempts to appear like everything was fine at home. "Honey, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," she said one afternoon as we were folding sweaters in the women's department. "Are you sure you're getting enough support? At home?" I gave her the same vague responses I had perfected over the years, but Janet wasn't easily fooled. She had seen too much of life to be deceived by surface appearances, and she made it clear that she was available if I ever needed someone to talk to. "Sometimes we think we're protecting our families by keeping our struggles private," she said, her hands moving efficiently through the pile of clothing. "But there's a difference between privacy and isolation. And isolation can be dangerous when you're dealing with difficult situations." Her words haunted me for days. Was I protecting my family by staying, by trying to keep us together despite David's deteriorating behavior? Or was I actually putting my children at greater risk by normalizing a household where anger and fear were constant companions? The answer came on a scorching August afternoon when the temperature reached 115 degrees and the air conditioning in our house broke down. David had been drinking since lunch, frustrated by the heat and the repair estimate that we couldn't afford, and his mood was darker than I had seen it in weeks. Emma had invited her friend Sarah over to work on a school project, and the 2 girls were sitting at the kitchen table with their books and papers spread out, trying to concentrate despite the oppressive heat. David came into the kitchen for another beer and immediately began complaining about the mess, about the noise, about teenagers who didn't understand that some people were trying to think. "Can't you girls do this somewhere else?" he demanded, his words slightly slurred. "This is my house and I shouldn't have to listen to your chattering when I'm trying to relax." Emma looked at me with pleading eyes, and I could see the embarrassment burning in her cheeks as her friend witnessed her father's unreasonable behavior. "They're just working on homework, David," I said quietly. "They'll be finished soon." "I don't care what they're working on," he snapped, his voice rising to the volume that always made my stomach clench with anxiety. "This is my kitchen table, in my house, and I want them gone. Now." Sarah, a sweet girl who had never experienced anything like David's volatile temper, began gathering her papers with shaking hands. I could see the confusion and fear in her face as she tried to understand why her friend's father was being so cruel over something so insignificant. "Dad, please," Emma said, her voice small and embarrassed. "We'll go to my room. You don't have to yell." "Don't tell me what I have to do in my own house," David roared, slamming his beer bottle down so hard on the counter that foam erupted from the top. "I'm sick and tired of being treated like a guest in my own home, like my comfort and my needs don't matter to anyone in this family." That's when I saw something that changed everything. Sarah, this innocent 15-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong except try to do homework with her friend, was looking at David with the Same expression of terror that I saw in my own children's eyes every day. She was witnessing the reality of our household, seeing firsthand the fear and chaos that Emma lived with constantly, and the shame that washed over me was so intense it took my breath away. "That's enough," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "David, you're scaring the girls. This is completely inappropriate." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see David's face change as he realized that I had just contradicted him in front of witnesses, that I had chosen to defend the children rather than enable his behavior. The silence stretched between us, thick with the kind of tension that precedes violence, and I watched his hands clench into fists at his sides. "Get out," he said to Sarah, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house right now." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her backpack and ran for the front door, leaving Emma sitting at the table with tears streaming down her face. I could hear Sarah's car starting in the driveway, could imagine her driving home to tell her parents about the crazy man who had screamed at her for no reason. Could picture the phone calls that would follow as word spread through the school that Emma Mitchell's father was unstable and potentially dangerous. "Look what you've done," David said, turning his fury on me now that Sarah was gone. "You've humiliated me in front of that girl, made me look like some kind of monster in my own home. She'll go home and tell her parents that Emma's father is a drunk and an abuser, and it will be all your fault for not supporting me." "You humiliated yourself," I replied, the words coming from some deep well of courage I didn't know I still possessed. "That girl did nothing to deserve being screamed at, and neither did Emma. Your behavior was completely out of line." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a car accident. David's face contorted with rage at my defiance, at my refusal to apologize for his actions, at my audacity in holding him accountable for his behavior. He took a step toward me, then another, his eyes wild with the kind of fury that I had learned to fear above all else. "Don't you ever contradict me in front of other people again," he snarled, his face inches from mine. "Don't you dare make me look like the bad guy when I'm just trying to have some peace in my own home." I could smell the alcohol on his breath, could see the veins standing out in his neck, could feel the heat radiating from his body as his anger reached a boiling point. Emma was still sitting at the table, her homework forgotten as she watched her parents face off in a confrontation. That felt different from all the others, more final somehow. "I'm not making you look like anything," I said, my voice trembling but determined. "Your behavior speaks for itself." That's when he hit me. Not the backhanded slap that had marked previous escalations, but a closed-fist punch that sent me reeling backward into the kitchen cabinets. The impact was so sudden and so violent that for a moment I couldn't process what had happened. I tasted blood in my mouth, felt my lips swelling already, and through the ringing in my ears I could hear Emma screaming, "Mom! Mom, are you okay?" I touched my face with shaking fingers, feeling the damage, trying to understand how we had gotten to this point. David stood over me, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched, and for a moment I thought he was going to hit me again. But then he seemed to see Emma's face, seemed to realize what he had done in front of our daughter, and something in his expression shifted from rage to horror. "Karyle, I'm sorry," he said, reaching toward me with the same hands that had just assaulted me. "I didn't mean to hit you that hard. You just pushed me too far and I lost control." I scrambled to my feet, my back against the kitchen cabinets, my eyes never leaving his face. This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for throughout our entire marriage. The line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. He had hit me before, but never like this, never with such calculated violence, never in front of one of our children. "Emma, go to your room," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the chaos in my heart. "Mom, you're bleeding," she said, her face pale with shock. "Go to your room now," I repeated, and something in my tone must have conveyed the urgency because she obeyed immediately, though I could hear her crying as she ran up the stairs. David and I stood in the kitchen, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, the heat still oppressive without the air conditioning. And I realized that this was the moment everything changed. Not gradually, not with the slow erosion of respect and safety that had characterized the previous years, but instantly and completely. "I want you to leave," I said, my hand pressed to my swollen lip. "Karyle, let me explain," he began, but I cut him off. "I want you to pack a bag and leave this house, tonight." "This is my house," he said, his voice taking on that dangerous edge again. "I'm not going anywhere. You're overreacting to an accident, and I'm not going to be punished for losing my temper when you were deliberately provoking me." "An accident?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You punched me in the face, David, in front of our daughter. That wasn't an accident. That was assault." "Don't be so dramatic," he said, but I could see the fear creeping into his eyes as he realized that something fundamental had shifted in our dynamic. "You're fine. It's not like I gave you a black eye or broke your nose. You're making this into something bigger than it is." That's when I understood with perfect clarity that David would never change, would never see his behavior as anything other than justified reactions to my failures as a wife and mother. He would always find ways to minimize the damage he caused, to shift blame, to make his violence my fault somehow. The cycle of abuse that had trapped me for nearly 2 decades would continue until one of us was dead, and I finally admitted to myself that he was capable of killing me. The realization didn't come with panic or hysteria, but with a strange, cold calm that settled over me like armor. I had reached the bottom of the well of fear and found something solid to stand on, something that felt like bedrock truth. I was going to leave him, and I was going to take my children with me, and if that meant starting over with nothing at 40 years old, then that's what I would do. "You have until tomorrow morning to find somewhere else to stay," I said, my voice steady and final. "If you're still here when I get home from work, I'm calling the police." "You wouldn't dare," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Try me," I replied, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him standing there among the scattered homework papers and the smell of spilled beer. That night, I lay in bed, listening to David pack his things in the room down the hall, listening to him mutter and curse as he threw clothes into suitcases. Emma came to my room around midnight, crawling into bed beside me like she used to do when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" she whispered in the darkness. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I know that what happened today can never happen again. You and Michael deserve to feel safe in your own home. And so do I." She was quiet for a long time, and I thought she had fallen asleep when she spoke again. "I'm glad you told him to leave," she said, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear. "I've been scared for a long time, Mom. We both have." My heart broke and healed simultaneously as I held my daughter close, understanding that my children had been waiting for me to find the courage to protect them, had been hoping that someday their mother would choose their safety over their father's comfort. The guilt was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. I had failed them by staying as long as I had, but I wouldn't fail them again. In the morning, David's truck was gone from the driveway, along with most of his clothes and personal belongings. He had left a note on the kitchen table, full of self-pity and blame, promising to stay away until I came to my senses and stopped overreacting to normal marital conflicts. The note went straight into the trash, along with 17 years of excuses and false hope. The breaking point had finally come, and I was still standing, bruised and scared and uncertain about the future, but still standing. The hardest part of my journey was about to begin, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had a chance of surviving it. The first week without David in the house felt like living in a foreign country where I didn't speak the language. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow unfamiliar, and I found myself jumping at the ordinary creaks and settling sounds that had been masked for years by the constant tension of his presence. The silence should have been peaceful, But instead, it felt precarious, like the eye of a hurricane where you know the storm is far from over. Emma and Michael moved through those initial days like wild animals emerging from hiding, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as they realized their father's explosive temper was no longer waiting around every corner. I watched Michael laugh at something on television without first glancing toward the living room doorway to make sure it was safe. I saw Emma bring friends home from school again, their voices filling the house with the kind of easy teenage chatter that had been absent for so long. But the relief was complicated by a crushing weight of practical concerns that I had never had to face alone. David had always handled our finances, our insurance, our major decisions, and now I was staring at a pile of bills and documents that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. The mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks. The car insurance needed renewal, and the refrigerator was making a grinding sound that suggested expensive repairs on the horizon. My part-time job at the department store barely covered groceries and gas, let alone the full expenses of maintaining a household. I had been so focused on the emotional survival of getting David out of the house that I hadn't fully comprehended the financial reality of supporting 2 teenagers on a retail salary. The panic attacks started on the 4th night, waking me from restless sleep with my heart racing and my chest tight with the fear that I had made a terrible mistake, that I had traded one kind of disaster for another. Janet at work noticed my distraction immediately. She found me in the break room one afternoon, staring at the stack of bills I had brought with me, my calculator showing numbers that didn't add up to anything resembling financial stability. "Honey, you look like you're drowning," she said, settling into the chair across from me with her coffee and a concerned expression. "Is there anything I can do to help?" For the first time in years, I found myself telling the truth about my situation to someone outside my immediate family. The words tumbled out in a rush of fear and shame and desperate need for guidance. I told her about David's violence, about finally finding the courage to ask him to leave, about the overwhelming reality of trying to support my children alone. Janet listened without judgment, her experienced eyes taking in details I hadn't even realized I was sharing. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself for the well-meaning advice about reconciliation and trying harder that I had heard from other people over the years. "The first thing you need to know," she said finally, "is that you did the right thing, the hardest thing, but the right thing. The second thing you need to know is that you're not as alone as you feel right now." She pulled a small notebook from her purse and began writing down names and phone numbers. Legal aid services for women leaving abusive relationships, counseling centers that offered sliding scale fees, government assistance programs that could help with utilities and food costs, support groups for domestic violence survivors. "I went through something similar 15 years ago," she said, her voice matter-of-fact but kind. "Different circumstances, but the same fear about whether I could make it on my own. It's terrifying and exhausting, but it's possible. You just have to take it one day at a time and accept help when it's offered." The idea of accepting charity, of admitting publicly that I couldn't handle my own life, went against everything I had been taught about independence and self-reliance. But as I looked at the list Janet had written, I realized that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. My children's stability and safety were more important than my ego. The legal aid office was located in a part of Phoenix I had never visited, a neighborhood of strip malls and government buildings that felt worlds away from our suburban subdivision. The waiting room was filled with women who looked as overwhelmed and frightened as I felt, some with children clinging to their legs, others sitting alone with the hollow-eyed expression I was beginning to recognize as the face of survival. The attorney who met with me was younger than I expected, a woman in her early 30s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that was both reassuring and intimidating. Sarah Chen had been practicing family law for 6 years, she told me, and had seen every variation of domestic violence cases imaginable. "The good news is that Arizona has strong protective laws for domestic violence victims," she explained, spreading legal documents across her desk. The challenging news is that your husband's absence from the house doesn't mean the legal complications are over. You'll need to file for a restraining order, initiate divorce proceedings, and establish temporary custody and support arrangements. The legal vocabulary was overwhelming, but Sarah was patient in explaining each step of the process. A restraining order would legally prohibit David from coming within a certain distance of me, the children, and our home. Divorce proceedings would officially dissolve our marriage and divide our assets and debts. Temporary custody arrangements would ensure that I had legal authority to make decisions about Emma and Michael's education and medical care. "Has he tried to contact you since he left?" Sarah asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. "He's called several times," I admitted. The first few calls were angry, demanding that I stop being ridiculous and let him come home. Then they became more manipulative, with him crying and begging for another chance. "And how did you respond?" I hung up, every time. Sarah nodded, approvingly. "That's exactly right. Document every attempt at contact, but don't engage in conversation. Men like your husband often escalate their behavior when they realize they're losing control. And the period right after separation can be the most dangerous time for women leaving abusive relationships." The statistics she shared with me were sobering. Women were most likely to be seriously injured or killed by their abusers during the first few months after leaving. Restraining orders were helpful, but not foolproof. They were pieces of paper that couldn't physically stop a determined abuser from violating their terms. I would need to be vigilant about my safety and my children's safety in ways I had never had to consider before. That night, I sat Emma and Michael down at our kitchen table for the most difficult conversation of my parenting life. They needed to understand that our situation was potentially dangerous, that their father's absence didn't guarantee our safety, and that we all needed to be careful about our routines and whereabouts until the legal proceedings were complete. "Is Dad going to try to hurt us?" Michael asked, his 13-year-old voice trying to sound brave but not quite succeeding. "I don't think so," I answered honestly. "But we need to be prepared just in case. That means no opening the door to anyone unless you're absolutely certain it's safe. It means calling me immediately if you see his truck in the neighborhood. It means staying with friends or at school if you ever feel unsafe walking home." Emma, who had witnessed the final confrontation and understood the gravity of our situation better than her younger brother, asked the question I had been dreading. "What if he doesn't agree to the divorce? What if he tries to make us come back?" "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But I promise you both that I will never put you in danger again. Whatever it takes, whatever sacrifices we have to make, we're going to build a life where you feel safe and loved and free to be yourselves." The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I spent the intervening days gathering documentation of David's abuse. The journal I had been keeping became crucial evidence, along with photographs of injuries I had taken over the years and medical records from emergency room visits I had explained away as accidents. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the physician who had treated me for a sprained wrist the previous year, remembered the incident clearly when I called to request copies of my medical records. "Mrs. Mitchell, I have to tell you, I suspected at the time that your injury wasn't caused by a fall down the stairs as you reported. I'm glad you're finally getting help." Her words stung because they confirmed what I had already known but been unwilling to acknowledge. Other people had seen through my lies and cover stories, had recognized the signs of abuse that I had worked so hard to hide. The shame was overwhelming, but it was also liberating in a strange way. I no longer had to pretend that everything was fine, no longer had to exhaust myself maintaining a facade that had fooled no one anyway. David's reaction to being served with the restraining order papers was swift and predictable. He called the house within hours of receiving them, his voice a mixture of outrage and wounded self-pity that I recognized from countless previous arguments. "Karyle, this is insane. he said when I made the mistake of answering the phone. A restraining order? You're treating me like some kind of criminal when all I did was lose my temper one time. This is going to destroy my reputation, my business relationships, everything I've worked for. You lost your temper and punched me in the face, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. In front of our daughter. That's not a momentary lapse of judgment, David. That's assault. I barely touched you, he protested, and I could hear the genuine bewilderment in his voice. In his mind, he had revised the incident until it became something minor, a slight push or a gentle correction that I was deliberately mischaracterizing. You're blowing this completely out of proportion because you want to punish me for having financial problems. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with David cycling through the familiar patterns of minimizing his behavior, blaming external circumstances, and accusing me of overreacting. When he finally hung up, I realized that nothing had changed in his fundamental understanding of our relationship. He still believed that his anger was justified, that his violence was my fault, that I was the problem that needed to be fixed. The support group Sarah had recommended met every Thursday evening in the basement of a Methodist church on the other side of town. The first time I walked into that room full of women who had experienced domestic violence, I felt like I was wearing a scarlet letter, branded with the shame of having been someone's victim. But as I listened to their stories, I began to understand that domestic violence crossed every boundary of age, race, education, and economic status. There was Maria, a 28-year-old nurse whose husband had isolated her from her family and friends, so completely that she had no one to turn to when his emotional abuse escalated to physical violence. There was Ruth, a 55-year-old teacher whose husband had seemed like the perfect gentleman to everyone who knew them, but who had terrorized her behind closed doors for over 20 years. There was Jennifer, barely out of college, whose boyfriend had convinced her that his jealousy and controlling behavior were proof of how much he loved her. Each woman's story was different in its details, but devastatingly similar in its patterns. The gradual erosion of self-esteem, the increasing isolation from supportive relationships, the cycle of tension, explosion, remorse, and temporary reconciliation that kept them trapped in situations that were slowly destroying them. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the therapist who facilitated our group, helped us understand that leaving an abusive relationship was not a single event, but a process that could take months or years to complete fully. Even after the physical separation, there were emotional and psychological ties that needed to be severed, legal and financial complications that could drag on indefinitely, and the ongoing work of rebuilding a sense of self that had been systematically dismantled. Healing from domestic violence is not a linear process, she explained during one of our sessions. You'll have good days when you feel strong and confident in your decision to leave, and you'll have difficult days when you question everything and wonder if you made a mistake. Both types of days are normal and necessary parts of your recovery. The difficult days came more frequently than I had expected. There were nights when the financial pressure felt crushing, when I lay awake calculating and recalculating our expenses and wondering how we would make it through the next month. There were moments when I saw happy couples at the grocery store or at Emma's school events and felt a stab of loneliness so acute it took my breath away. Most challenging were the times when David's manipulative calls worked their way into my thoughts, when his accusations that I was destroying our family for selfish reasons echoed in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. He had planted seeds of doubt and self-blame so deeply that even with his physical absence, his voice continued to undermine my confidence in ways I was just beginning to recognize. 3 months after David left, I received a letter from his attorney requesting mediation to discuss reconciliation and family reunification. The legal language was formal and intimidating, but the underlying message was clear. David was not accepting our separation as permanent, and he was prepared to use the legal system to pressure me into resuming our marriage. Sarah Chen read, the letter with the practiced eye of someone who had seen similar tactics many times before. "This is a common strategy," she explained. "He's hoping that the stress of legal proceedings will wear you down enough that you'll agree to take him back to avoid the hassle and expense of a prolonged court battle." "Can he force me to go to mediation?" I asked, the familiar anxiety creeping into my chest. "No, but he can make the divorce process more expensive and time-consuming if you refuse. However, I should warn you that mediation in domestic violence cases is rarely successful. The power imbalance that exists in your marriage doesn't disappear just because you're sitting in a neutral office with a trained mediator." The mediation session was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday morning in November, 6 months after I had asked David to leave our house. I hadn't seen him since that August afternoon when he had packed his belongings and driven away, and I wasn't prepared for the emotional impact of being in the same room with him again. He looked older, thinner, and there was a desperate quality to his appearance that was both pitiable and frightening. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. But when he saw me enter the mediation office, his face lit up with the same charming smile that had captivated me in college, and for a moment, I could see the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Karyle, sweetheart, you look beautiful," he said, rising from his chair as if to embrace me. "I've missed you so much. We both know this whole separation has gone on long enough. It's time for us to come home to each other." The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a calm, professional demeanor, gently redirected David to his seat and began explaining the ground rules for our session. But I was barely listening to her words because I was too busy studying my husband's face, looking for signs of the genuine change and growth that would need to have occurred for any reconciliation to be possible. What I saw instead was the same fundamental lack of accountability that had characterized our entire marriage. David spoke eloquently about the stress he had been under, the pressures that had contributed to his behavior, the lessons he had learned during our time apart. But he never once acknowledged the specific harm he had caused to me and our children. He never took full responsibility for his actions without qualifying them with explanations and excuses. When the mediator asked him directly what changes he had made to address the problems in our marriage, his answer revealed everything I needed to know about his capacity for genuine transformation. "I've been seeing a counselor," he said, "and I've learned a lot about managing stress and communication techniques. I understand now that Karyle felt unsupported during my business difficulties, and I'm committed to being more attentive to her needs. I think if we both try harder to understand each other's perspectives, we can rebuild what we had and maybe even make it stronger than before." The mediation session lasted 3 hours, but I knew within the first 30 minutes that reconciliation was impossible. David had not changed in any fundamental way. He had simply learned new vocabulary to describe the same old patterns of minimizing his behavior and shifting responsibility. He still saw our marriage as a problem to be managed rather than a relationship between equals, still viewed my decision to leave as an overreaction that needed to be corrected rather than a reasonable response to years of abuse. When we finally left the mediator's office, David followed me to my car, his demeanor shifting from conciliatory to desperate as he realized that his charm offensive had failed to achieve its intended effect. "This is crazy, Karyle," he said, his voice taking on the edge of anger that I remembered all too well. "You're throwing away 17 years of marriage, destroying our children's lives, all because you can't forgive one moment of weakness. What kind of Christian woman gives up on her family instead of working to heal it?" "The kind who chooses safety over submission," I replied, unlocking my car door with hands that trembled only slightly. "The kind who finally understands that love doesn't require accepting abuse." As I drove away from the mediation office, leaving David standing in the parking lot with rain soaking through his jacket, I felt a profound sense of finality settle over me like a blanket. The man I had married was truly gone, if he had ever existed at all, and the process of grieving that loss could finally begin in earnest. The divorce was finalized on a crisp February morning in 1991, almost exactly 1 year after I had first acknowledged in my hidden journal that my marriage was destroying me. I sat in the courthouse wearing my best dress, the same navy blue one I had worn to Emma's 8th grade graduation, listening to the judge declare that David and I were no longer legally bound to each other. The words should have felt liberating, but instead they felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from a great distance. David wasn't present for the final hearing. His attorney explained that he was out of state pursuing business opportunities, but I suspected the real reason was that he still couldn't accept the permanence of what was happening. Even after months of legal proceedings, part of him believed this was all an elaborate tantrum that would eventually pass, that I would come to my senses and welcome him back into our lives. Walking out of that courthouse as a single woman at 41 years old, I felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. The future stretched ahead of me like an unmarked path through unknown territory, full of possibilities I had never dared to imagine and challenges I wasn't sure I could handle. But for the first time in decades, the path was mine to choose. The financial struggles didn't magically disappear with the divorce decree. Child support was sporadic at best, arriving weeks late with increasingly creative excuses about cash flow problems and delayed payments from clients. I had to make difficult decisions about which bills to pay first, which utilities could be shut off temporarily, which luxuries we could no longer afford. Emma and Michael learned to shop at thrift stores without complaint, to appreciate generic brand groceries, to find entertainment in free activities like hiking and library visits. But something wonderful was happening alongside the financial stress. Our house was becoming a home again, filled with laughter and music and the comfortable chaos of teenagers who no longer had to monitor every word and movement for fear of triggering an explosion. Emma's friends started gathering in our living room for homework sessions and movie nights, their easy chatter a soundtrack of normalcy I had almost forgotten was possible. Michael joined the school chess club and began bringing home stories of tournaments and victories, his confidence growing as he discovered talents that had been suppressed by years of walking on eggshells. I started therapy with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her 50s who specialized in domestic violence recovery. The weekly sessions were both painful and healing, requiring me to examine patterns of thinking and behavior that had developed over 17 years of marriage to an abuser. I had to learn to recognize the difference between healthy compromise and dangerous accommodation, between love and fear, between supporting a partner and enabling destructive behavior. Recovery from domestic violence isn't just about leaving the relationship, Dr. Walsh explained during one of our early sessions. It's about rebuilding your sense of self, learning to trust your own perceptions again, and developing healthy boundaries that will protect you in future relationships. The concept of future relationships seemed impossibly distant and complicated. How could I ever trust my judgment about men again when I had been so thoroughly deceived by David's initial charm? How could I risk exposing my children to another potentially dangerous situation? The safer choice seemed to be avoiding romantic relationships entirely, focusing my energy on healing and raising Emma and Michael. Janet at work had become more than a supervisor. She was a mentor and friend who helped me navigate the practical challenges of single motherhood. When the assistant manager position opened up at the store, she encouraged me to apply despite my lack of retail management experience. "You have something more valuable than experience," she told me as we reviewed my application together. "You have resilience, problem-solving skills, and the ability to connect with people who are going through difficult times. Those qualities can't be taught." Getting the promotion felt like winning the lottery. The additional income wasn't substantial, but it was enough to make our financial situation stable rather than desperate. More importantly, it gave me a sense of professional identity that had been missing during my years as a stay-at-home wife. I was good at retail management, discovering talents for inventory control and customer service that I had never known I possessed. The support group continued to be a lifeline throughout those first years of rebuilding. Watching other women, Navigate similar challenges reminded me that I wasn't alone in this journey, that the feelings of doubt and fear and occasional overwhelming sadness were normal parts of the healing process. We celebrated each other's victories, no matter how small, and provided comfort during the inevitable setbacks. Maria, the nurse whose husband had isolated her so completely, got her own apartment and started dating a gentle man she met at church. Ruth, the teacher who had endured 20 years of psychological abuse, went back to school to get her master's degree and eventually became a principal. Jennifer, the young woman whose boyfriend had convinced her that jealousy was love, started her own business and bought a house with money she had saved from her careful budgeting. Their stories gave me hope that transformation was not only possible, but inevitable if I continued doing the hard work of healing. But the timeline was longer and more complicated than I had initially imagined. There were still nights when I woke up in a panic, convinced I could hear David's truck in the driveway. There were still moments when his voice echoed in my head, criticizing decisions I was making or undermining my confidence in my parenting abilities. Emma graduated from high school in 1993 with grades good enough to earn her a partial scholarship to Arizona State University. Watching her walk across that stage in her cap and gown, I felt a fierce pride mixed with amazement that we had all survived the destruction of our family unit. She had not only survived, but thrived, becoming a young woman with clear goals and unshakable confidence in her own worth. "I want to study psychology," she told me over dinner one evening during her senior year. "I want to help other families like ours, kids who are growing up in homes where they don't feel safe." Her choice of career path was both heartbreaking and inspiring. My daughter was going to transform her painful experiences into a source of healing for others, turning trauma into purpose in a way that filled me with admiration for her strength and wisdom. Michael, now 15 and taller than me, had grown into a thoughtful young man with his father's intelligence, but none of his anger. He excelled in science and mathematics, spending hours working on projects that he explained to me with enthusiasm I could barely follow but completely enjoyed. The fear that had marked his early adolescence had been replaced by curiosity and confidence. David's contact with the children had dwindled to occasional phone calls and birthday cards with sporadic checks enclosed. He had moved to Nevada, pursuing some new business venture that he claimed would finally make him wealthy enough to provide for his family properly. The children were polite but distant during his rare calls, having learned to protect themselves emotionally from his unpredictable presence in their lives. In 1994, 3 years after our divorce, I met Thomas Henderson at a community education class about personal finance. He was a divorced father of 2 teenage boys, an accountant who had been handling his own recovery from a marriage that had ended due to his ex-wife's alcoholism. We started as study partners, helping each other understand investment strategies and retirement planning, but gradually developed a friendship that felt comfortable and unthreatening. Thomas was everything David had never been: patient, consistent, genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions, and completely supportive of my independence. He never tried to solve my problems for me or make decisions about my life. Instead, he listened when I needed to talk, offered advice when I asked for it, and respected my boundaries without making me feel guilty for having them. Our relationship developed slowly over months of coffee dates and group activities with our children. I was hyper-vigilant at first, analyzing every interaction for signs of controlling behavior or hidden anger. But Thomas remained steady and kind, even when I was difficult or defensive, even when my trauma responses were triggered by innocent comments or gestures. "I'm not him," he said gently one evening when I had overreacted to his suggestion about a restaurant for dinner. "I know you have reasons to be careful, and I respect that. But I hope you'll give me the chance to show you that not all men are dangerous." Dr. Walsh helped me work through the complicated emotions that arose as my relationship with Thomas deepened. Learning to trust again required conscious effort and daily choices to believe in someone's goodness, despite my hard-earned cynicism about marriage and men. Healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened to you, she explained. It means integrating those experiences into your life story without letting them control your future choices. Thomas isn't David, and your relationship with him doesn't have to follow the same patterns that led to disaster in your marriage. Thomas and I were married in a small ceremony in 1996, 5 years after my divorce was finalized. Emma was in college, but came home for the wedding, walking me down the aisle in the absence of my father who had passed away the previous year. Michael served as Thomas's best man, having developed a genuine fondness for the man who treated his mother with consistent kindness and respect. The second marriage was nothing like the first. Thomas and I were partners in the truest sense, making decisions together, supporting each other's goals, and maintaining our individual identities while building a shared life. We combined our families carefully and thoughtfully, attending counseling sessions to help our teenagers adjust to the new dynamic. Financial security came gradually but steadily. Thomas's accounting practice grew, my retail management career advanced to regional supervisor, and Emma graduated from college with a degree in psychology and immediately began working with at-risk youth. Michael earned a scholarship to study engineering, following his passion for problem-solving in a completely different field than his father had chosen. In 2000, Emma married her college sweetheart, a kind man who reminded me of Thomas in his steady reliability and obvious adoration of his wife. Their wedding was a celebration of love that felt completely different from my own first wedding, marked by joy rather than anxiety, by confidence rather than desperate hope. When Emma's daughter Sophie was born in 2002, I held my granddaughter with an overwhelming sense of completion. This little girl would grow up in a home where love was expressed through kindness rather than control, where conflicts were resolved through communication rather than intimidation, where her worth as a person was never questioned or diminished. Michael married his college girlfriend in 2004, and their son James arrived 2 years later. Watching my children build healthy relationships and raise their own families with wisdom and intentionality felt like the ultimate vindication of all. The difficult choices I had made during those terrifying early years of single motherhood. David remained a peripheral figure in our lives, appearing occasionally for major events, but never again wielding the power to disrupt our peace. He had remarried and divorced twice more, a pattern that confirmed what I had always suspected about his capacity for genuine change. The children maintained minimal contact with him, more out of obligation than affection, and their own families became their priority as they entered adulthood. Now, at 74, I look back on that night, when I blacked out on my kitchen floor as the moment my real life began. Not because the abuse was acceptable or necessary, not because I'm grateful for the trauma, but because it forced me to find a strength I didn't know I possessed, and to build a life that was authentically mine, rather than a performance designed to keep someone else happy. The woman who stood up to David that August afternoon, who demanded he leave our house, who filed for divorce despite her terror of being alone, was someone I had to become rather than someone I had always been. She was forged in the crucible of desperation and necessity, born from the ashes of illusions and false hopes that had sustained me for too many years. Today, I volunteer at a domestic violence shelter, sharing my story with women who are where I once was, trapped in relationships that are slowly destroying them. I tell them what someone should have told me decades earlier, that leaving is possible, that starting over is survivable, that there is life after the death of everything you thought you wanted. Some of them listen with the hunger of people ready to save themselves. Others hear my words, but aren't yet prepared to act on them, still hoping that love and patience and perfect behavior on their part will somehow transform their abusers into different people. I don't judge them for their choices, because I remember the paralysis of fear, the weight of responsibility for keeping families together, the deep-seated belief that somehow this was all my fault. But I plant seeds of possibility in their minds, Just as other women planted seeds in mine during those dark years when I couldn't imagine any future beyond survival, I tell them that healing is possible, that their children can recover from trauma, that love exists without violence, that they deserve relationships built on respect rather than fear. The journey from victim to survivor, to someone who helps other victims become survivors has taken decades, and it's not a path I would wish on anyone. But it's the path that led me to this life, surrounded by children and grandchildren who know their worth, married to a man who cherishes rather than controls me, contributing to a community of women who refuse to accept abuse as the price of love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.